going to talk about some of the, oh, darn it. Okay, can everyone see that again?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, good. So I'm going to talk about some of the restoration and management work that we do at two natural areas in Clark County, Washougal Oaks Natural Area and Lacamas Prairie. But first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about DNR and the Natural Areas Program, because I don't know how many people are familiar with them. Washington DNR does a lot of different things. We are land manager of over 5 million acres statewide, 3 million of upland forest, agricultural, grazing, and urban lands. And those are managed, for trust beneficiaries. Timber is managed for funding for universities, schools, prisons, hospitals. And then we've got aquatic lands, bedlands, tidelands, and shorelands that are also managed. We've got easements and we do shellfish harvest. But I work in the Natural Areas Program, and to date, we've protected over 158,000 acres of conservation land statewide. And it is the most important conservation program in the state, more than the Nature Conservancy, the Forest Service, BLM. In terms of acreage of habitat for rare plants and animals and plant communities. So our mission is conserving Washington's native species and ecosystems today and for future generations. So much like what the Nature Conservancy does, we are trying to protect representative examples of different plant communities and habitat for rare plants and animals statewide. So this bog here is a plant community. Golden paintbrush is a really rare paintbrush found in, I think, 11 sites worldwide. And then this is the streaked hornlark. So do you guys see this on the side of my screen? Should I get this out of the way? Maybe.
We're not seeing anything troublesome.
Okay, good. I guess it's just a few pictures of the Zoom, so I'll move that over. Okay. So we have two different natural area designations, natural area preserves and natural resources conservation areas. And their overarching goals are very similar. Natural area preserves tend to be a little more sensitive and a little bit less conducive to just having open access and recreation. But their purpose is protecting habitat for rare species and rare plant communities, but also environmental education and scientific research. So we have, I've had several grad students do their master's work on my sites, but these sites they're baseline reference areas. If someone wants to know what a Willamette Valley wet prairie should look like, and they want to restore a really damaged prairie to that. And then genetic resources of native plants and animals, their habitat for vanishing and rare species. And then where appropriate, they provide public access. So as long as it's not damaging what we're trying to protect at the site, we have public access there. So NRCAs, again, very similar. The only difference is that they have a little more latitude in allowing public access. This is Table Mountain in the gorge, a very rigorous hike you can do with an incredible view. If you're familiar with Mima Mounds up towards Olympia, that's actually a natural area preserve. Merrill Lake is a natural resource conservation area, and we've got a 1 mile old growth trail there. So yeah, opportunities for low impact public use, but NRCAs also provide protection for geologic resources, cultural resources, so archaeological resources, and scenic resources. Oops. So this is just a map showing NRCAs and NAPs across the state. And again, we're trying to protect as many representative examples of different types of communities as possible. So bogs, old growth forest, salt marsh, wet prairie, upland dry prairies, shrub steppe on the east side, ponderosa pine. So that's kind of the idea. I'm going to be talking primarily about Lacamas Prairie and Washougal Oaks that are down here in the southeast part of the county. But Merrill Lake is also pretty close by, and there's a nice, I mentioned our old growth trail there. Or if you're into fly fishing, it's one of the few fly fishing only lakes in the state. So I want to mention the Natural Heritage Program. It's a program that's really important to our program within DNR. And it's a small group of scientists that they help categorize and catalog the rare plants and plant communities statewide. It was established in 1977. They're recognized leaders in conservation science. We have a rare plant botanist, 2 ecologists. We used to have a zoologist. And then we have someone that does information science, the GIS mapping and data management. So they, like I mentioned, they inventory and keep track of our rare plants and plant communities. Washington Fish and Wildlife will keep track of the rare animals. And then they prioritize. So they look at these plant communities and they look at how good, what kind of condition they're in. Are they worthy of protection? Are they, one of the best examples of a bog in the state and really need to be protected? Or are they really in poor condition and probably too far gone? And then, so yeah, they're really important to us because they will let us know new areas that need to be protected. So just after I started about 17 years ago, they had proposed Washougal Oaks as a site that needed to be protected because it was the largest, basically, group of, or kind of clump of rare oaks, Oregon white oaks in the state. And they work with public and private partners for long-term solutions. So, and they also, private consulting companies, if they need to know where rare plants are or plant communities are statewide, they go to our heritage program. So most of the money that we use to protect these lands, to purchase these lands, comes from the Washington State Recreation and Conservation Office. And within the Washington Wildlife and Recreation Program, we go after grants within different categories, primarily natural areas, riparian protection, urban wildlife, and sometimes critical habitat. And then when we're trying to go after restoration funding or funding for trails, we use these 2 different categories, the state lands development, state lands restoration. So that's a bit about what our programs do. But I just want to stress that it's really important. Hopefully all of you being gardeners sort of understand how important it is to protect, big chunks of habitat that have a diversity of native species in them, because, native plants and plant communities are the base of the whole food chain. I read a book, you guys would love this book. It's called Bringing Nature Home by Douglas Ptolemy. And he's an entomologist back east somewhere. I think he maybe teaches in Ohio, but he talks about basically how important it is to have a diversity of plants, because insect groups can be very picky about, insect families can be picky about what plants they like to feed on and nectar from and nest on. Some are generalists, but a lot are specialists. And so when we start losing, plant species and plant groups, it affects the whole food chain, basically. So it's really important to protect the examples. It's hard for me to see, plant communities lost. And, I don't know how many people understand that, just a field of grass is not a prairie. And in my view, a farmed forest is not the same thing as a native naturally regenerated forest, because it doesn't have the same structure and species diversity. So that's a little bit about our programs. So now specifically about Washougal Oaks and Lacamas Prairie. So Washougal Oaks was established in about 2003, and it lies just right off north of Highway 4 in southeast Clark County, near the Clark-Skamania County line. And it was established to protect one of the largest high-quality oak woodlands in Western Washington. It had a good, it's got a good mostly native understory. And when the site was set up, it was protecting a globally imperiled plant community, which is one of the 2 oak plant communities. So that's our highest ranking, basically our rarest type of plant community is globally imperiled. We have different rankings, and that just means that it's rare worldwide, globally. So we've got 2 different plant communities at Washougal Oaks. So they're both Oregon white oak plant communities. One is, the rarer one is the Oregon white oak, oval leaf viburnum, and poison oak plant community. So yeah, in parts of Washougal Oaks, there's a lot of poison oak in kind of the rocky, drier areas. The other plant community is Oregon white oak, Douglas fir, and snowberry. So got a mix of conifer and deciduous trees. But then there are several rare plants on site: tall bugbane, small flowered trillium, which is similar to our common trillium or wake robin, but the flower sits right on top of the leaves, and then the leaves can be blotchy, very pretty. Sometimes they're very darkly blotched. And then the petals are narrower than our common trillium. We've got a rare bird, the slender-billed white-breasted nuthatch. And it's a bird that used to range as far north as Thurston County, but now it's only found in Clark and Cowlitz counties in about 5 to 6 locations. So Ridgefield, Washougal Oaks, Lacamas Prairie, Steigerwald, and then a few other places. There's a rare salamander, the Larch Mountain salamander, that lives under talus, mossy talus slopes. And then we may have this rare squirrel, the western gray squirrel. I'm trying to figure out how to move this little bar here. It's kind of in my way. Okay, that's a little better. Anyhow, we're not sure about the gray squirrel. It's a big squirrel. Most of you are probably familiar with our eastern gray squirrel, which is non-native and the most common squirrel around town. Western gray squirrels are, they're very rare in Washington, and they're very shy in Washington for some reason. I've seen them in my mom's, when she lived in Corvallis, they'd be in her backyard, and you can see them at Sun River and Bend. And they're not that shy, but they're a big squirrel. They're probably 20 to 30% bigger than an eastern gray. They got a big bushy tail, and they're all silvery gray with no buffiness. So we've had some unsubstantiated sightings, both at Lacamas Prairie and Washougal Oaks, and we don't know if we have them or not. This is a squirrel hair trap. We put a walnut inside. They go in for the walnut, and they leave a little hair sample, and then you can ID them from their hair sample. And we put some of these up at Washougal Oaks and pretty much only got eastern gray squirrels. So anyhow, this is the site. This is Highway 14. If you know Steigerwald, which you probably do, this is Steigerwald. So yeah, our natural areas don't necessarily have to be owned and managed by DNR. We've got some of Steigerwald National Wildlife Refuge in there. There's some U.S. Forest Service. There's some Friends of the Gorge land that's outside our boundary. But anyhow, just briefly about how our preserves work. As I mentioned, our heritage program will set up a boundary. They'll establish a boundary around the rare features on the site, an ecological boundary. And these boundaries are designed to protect the bulk of the rare features there, along with some buffer. So, these are old cleared fields that are really not good habitat. They're non-native grasses mostly. So they used to be probably an oak conifer forest or an oak savanna. So we set up a boundary, and then in this case, with the exception of Steigerwald and the Forest Service, most of it was private land. So then we prioritize the land within the boundary, and we go start talking to private landowners. Well, first we hold a public meeting to let people know what we're doing and why we want to protect the site and how it works. And it always makes people nervous when we set up a boundary. They think the government's going to come in black helicopters and take their land. But we don't do any eminent domain. We don't condemn land. We only buy from willing sellers. So, we started talking to different landowners and saying, this is how it works. We do a third-party appraisal. We have it appraised for, highest and best use, market value. We make you an offer, and then you can take it or leave it. So this is what we have protected so far. This map's a little outdated. We have this piece, this 40-acre piece here. And then we've got some new funding to protect a bunch more. So we have a willing seller right here, and then along this riparian area here, and then hopefully some of this upland here. So that's the site. These are some of the species: oval leaf viburnum, which you don't see too often. It's a shrub. Chocolate lily or checkered lily. And then great camas, which is a species you don't see a lot of. Neither camas species are very common, but great camas in particular is not very common. So some of the work that we do, I pointed out some of the fields that were cleared in the past. So these are old pastures that were probably grazed. The previous owner had horses on these pastures, but they were likely grazed in the past. In fact, there was a dairy barn on this property, and so there was sure they had cattle. So we went in, we do a lot of weed control. There was a huge patch of blackberry up here. So we'll control the weeds as much as possible, and we kind of focus on what I call ecological game changers. Blackberry can just come in and totally swamp the system and shade native plants. So what we're doing in these weedy fields is planting oaks and then native shrubs in between the oaks. And so we basically just decided that we weren't going to work on the understory quite yet. There's just, you'd have to have a ton of native seed and just basically, herbicide the whole field. So our goal is to grow oaks and get a canopy and shade out some of these native plants, and then whatever, 30 to 40 to 50 years later, somebody can work on the understory. So we put tubes up around the oaks to keep the deer off of them, but it's been tricky. It's been tough to keep them up. We started with the bamboo posts, and those, after 2 or 3 years, rot out, and the wind is really strong in the gorge. So we went to PVC posts. We started putting these little sleeves over the top because we're getting our tubes ripped down and big holes ripped out of them. And we're pretty sure that what's happening is that we get these paper wasps that nest in the tubes, and then black bear will come in and they want to eat the larvae in those nests. And so they'll rip the tube apart. So it's been challenging trying to protect these oaks, but this is one of our early plantings, and these trees are even bigger than this now. Oaks grow very slowly. So these trees are, probably 15 years old now. This is a snowberry, hard to see. Oh, and we put these are raptor perches. When we planted our oaks, our tubes hadn't come in yet. And so the voles started to girdle a lot of our trees. And so we have to protect them from voles and deer. And so I was mad at the voles, so I put some raptor perches up, and they're probably helping a little bit. The other thing we've done is we've done some conifer thinning. Native peoples would intentionally set fires in basically throughout the West, throughout North America, for a number of reasons, to keep areas open for their game and food plants. They would sometimes drive game with fire. But without that, Doug fir is a very fast and high growing species. And so without both natural fire in the form of lightning and, human set fire, Doug fir will overtop and eventually kill oaks. And so we came in and did some thinning of the Doug fir. And primarily what we did was, we girdled hundreds and hundreds of trees. So this guy is girdling a tree by cutting the bark off. And you really have to cut down through the cambium layer in the tree. But we also had some trees topped. So we had climbers top them. And the benefit to topping a tree is that it rots from the top down and it stays up longer for a snag. A wild snags are, sure you probably hopefully know, snags are super important to wildlife. Primary cavity nesters like woodpeckers will come in and excavate a cavity, and then secondary cavity nesters like chickadees, bluebirds, small owls, bats, a number of cavity nesting species, nuthatches, will use that cavity. And then some species will use a snag with sloughing bark, like bats like to tuck away under sloughing bark. Some owls will nest on top of snags. So snags are super important. And then they fall down and become downed wood, which is very important, for habitat for amphibians and small mammals. So we did a lot of oak conifer thinning, primarily Doug fir. We left the cedar. Yeah, it was really only Doug fir. So we went out and marked the trees and then had a contractor cut trees down. In some areas in that rarer plant community where, fire probably played a bigger role and would have burned up some of that down wood, we actually flew out the down trees. And I'll mention that in a second. But these are some of our girdled trees. And one lesson we learned is that if you don't girdle down past that cambium layer, the tree is very adept at healing itself. So we had to go back and recut a lot of trees. These are trees that healed up and continued on living. So trees can be really tough. So yeah, these will be good snags, but they will rot from this base here, and eventually they'll fall quicker than a top tree. So we did take some of the trees and we helicopter logged them and flew them. It made an excellent opportunity to improve salmonid habitat in Lawton Creek, which is right within the site and right nearby. So we've got steelhead, coastal cutthroat, and coho salmon that spawn in the stream, and they're all threatened species. So there's excellent spawning gravel, but not much large woody debris in the stream. They used to think that it was bad for salmon and that salmon couldn't get up streams if there were logs in the way, so they would take them out. But now we're putting it back in to create microsites. And so, we took trees from this thinned area and flew them over to this area in red to, I'll show you in a second, to create habitat. And then we did some riparian plantings in here. This was the previous owner would dig the gravels out of the streams, and it was a gravel operation, and so there was a lot of damage to the riparian area, especially down in here. So this is what we did. We placed logs in the streams, and during the winter time you get really high flows, and so this is what happens. It flows under the log and scours out holes under the logs, and it creates these pools where especially juvenile fish can hide from predators. That was kind of the goal. So that was kind of our, our fish enhancement project that went really well with our log thinning operation. We did take a number of trees from the site, and that helped to pay for the project, but it was also grant funded as well. So we do a lot of education and outreach. This is a project, I might have done this right after I read that Douglas Bellamy book, or Tallamy book. But the idea was to teach middle school kids about the importance of native plant communities. And so I had them, sweep netting areas of, native plant communities and compared it to an area of mostly English ivy ground cover. You know, insects are super hard to identify, so I just had them basically make up their own names for the insects and try to count how many different species there were. And fortunately, it turned out that the native plant community had higher species diversity than the English ivy. But anyhow, so that was a fun project. But we work with different volunteer groups. This is the Veterans Conservation Corps. It's a program to get vets out in the woods as kind of therapy for PTSD. We did some planting and clearing of blackberry canes. So we'd come in and killed the blackberry here and did some native plantings. This is an Eagle Scout project. This was a couple brothers out of Kelso that came down and made some nuthatch boxes for our rare nuthatch. These are the two brothers, and one of them made the nuthatch boxes. The other made some purple martin boxes. These are scouts planting native species in old blackberry patches. This is a church out of Washougal doing a planting, and this is a Clark College class pulling some teasel, Washougal Oaks. So we do a lot of invasive weed control. This is blackberry. This is actually a Larch crew member of the correctional camp. And for some reason, they use chainsaws to clear blackberry. I tend to use weed eaters. So we clear the blackberry, we cut it down, and then when it resprouts, we'll treat it in the fall. So this is another plant that we've been battling and honestly losing to. It's an impossible plant to get rid of. It's called shining geranium. You do not want this in your yard. You don't want it in your garden. It's so hard to get rid of. It produces multiple flower generations per year and just kicks out a bunch of seed. So if you see it, get rid of it. It's got shiny leaves, not much hair on the upper surface, small pink flowers. And it's, you know, initially Washougal Oaks was basically the first place in the state that it was found from. And when I first started, our botanist said, I don't know what this plant is. It's not in the, you know, the Hitchcock Bible to Northwest plants, but I did find out by sending it around that it was this plant that was down in the Willamette Valley and was spreading northward. And it's here, it's all over Washington. So that's Washougal Oaks. Lacamas Prairie is also Clark County. It's a little bit north of Lacamas Lake and near Camas Meadows Golf Course, if you know where that is. This is a map of the site. This is the ecological boundary. This is Goodwin Road, and this is Ingalls Road, and Camas Meadows Golf Course is right here. So there's some county land here and some Columbia Land Trust here, but this is the land that we manage currently. This both of these sites are a new designation. This is a joint site where we have NAP and NRCA. So the more sensitive part of the site is encompassed within the NAP, and then the rest of it will be NRCA. So most of the rest of it is protected to protect the watershed that feeds into this wet prairie. So we have a lot of funding to purchase more land, but we're currently working with landowners to do that. These are some of the species that are rare on site and that the reason that we're protecting this site. So again, small flowered trillium that we have at Washougal Oaks. Nuttall's quillwort, which is a very primitive plant, very tiny. I hardly ever see it. It's a spore producing plant. And they have these sporangia that kind of pop open and then the spores float around in water and disperse. This is I think it's kind of a prehistoric plant called Oregon coyote thistle. And it has these leaves that come up early on that kind of look like aloe a little bit, but it has these funky blades that come up as well. They're not a true thistle. This is their flower. It's a spiky green flower. Paul's aster is in the sunflower family. Dense sedge is rare statewide, but pretty common on site. California compass plant is in the sunflower family. And we really only have a couple of these on site, but we're propagating, and so we have more. And then this yellow plant is Bradshaw's lomatium, and it's in the carrot family. You've probably seen other lomatiums in the gorge. This one was federally endangered and was very recently delisted. So, because of conservation efforts like Lacamas Prairie, it's been delisted. But for a while, it was thought to be really threatened. And there, I think maybe 20 sites throughout its range. In Washington, this is the only site it's known from. And then there's a lot of a fair amount of common camas on site, which is this blue flower. Oh boy, what did I just do? Okay, there we go. Oh, weird. Okay, so this is Bradshaw's lomatium. These are their, sort of the range. And then, it's only found in Clark County here. But it's a Willamette Valley species, endemic. So it's only found in the Willamette Valley and then a little bit of Clark County. It's got very dill-like leaves. So these are some of the rare species that are found on site. Again, we've had some, I call them Bigfoot sightings of the western gray squirrel. Our ecologist thought he saw one, and he knows them from Klickitat County where they're more common. The guy that used to manage the Green Mountain Golf Course believes he saw one on the golf course, and he used to hunt them in Oregon. In Oregon, they're doing a little better. I don't know if they're still a game species, but they were. And then I caught a glimpse of a tail that may or may not have been just a really quick look at a squirrel, and they have these big bushy tails. Anyhow, we have a good diversity of amphibians on site. We get, for a number of years, we had the Casey Center, which is a STEM program out of the Battleground School District where kids learn about the environment and agriculture. And so they'd come down and help count these egg masses in the ponds. And so we have a pretty good, red-legged frogs, I would say, are uncommon, but it's pretty cool to have a good diversity. We've got red-legged frogs, Pacific chorus frogs, northwestern salamanders, long-toed salamanders, unfortunately bullfrogs, which are non-natives. I guess that's it, but decent diversity for an urban site. We have the slender-billed white-breasted nuthatch. We've recently confirmed that we have red-shouldered hawks, which are not rare, but they're rare in Washington. They're really only in Southwest Washington. And then it's an important site for waterfowl in the wintertime. These, that wetland, the basin, it becomes a wetland. It just fills up with water, and Lacamas Creek floods its banks. And so it's a very wet area in the wintertime. And then we're trying to encourage purple martins to the site. They fly overhead, and we've had one attempt, but so far we haven't had them on site nesting. So, the site, like a lot of Southwest Washington, was heavily infested with Himalayan blackberry. The woodlands, the oak woodlands, you pretty much couldn't walk through them because they were just thick with blackberry. So I had a guy with a bobcat come in and shred it, and then we treated it in the fall. And this is what kind of came up: native fringe cup and small flower trillium. So I'm gonna have to move. I can see it's 7:43 here. We've done a lot of brush control in the prairie with weed eaters and controlled the ash that's moving out into the prairie. So without fire, prairies will move towards a woody system. So we cleared a lot of rows, and in places where we had native plant communities, native plants like this popcorn flower came back, and tufted hairgrass. But areas where it was primarily rows and it was more weedy, we're battling a lot of weeds in these brush patches. So this is what it looks like more today, Green Mountain in the background. So we've used prescribed fire to clear the brush and control woodies, but also prep the site for seeding and herbicide treatment of the non-native grasses. So, and I'll, if we have time, I'll play a 2-minute video of our prairie burn, but it's a very controlled burn. The wind speed, temperature, wind direction, everything has to be perfect for us to be able to burn. And we use DNR firefighters to do these burns. We've done a lot of propagation. I've got a greenhouse and plant propagation beds where we grow out seeds for the prairie primarily at Washougal Oaks. And we used WCC, Washington Conservation Corps, and more recently, you guys, the Master Gardeners, have helped collect seed and plant native species in these trays at your homes. So we do a lot of propagation of rare and common species that we plant back out in the prairie. This is Oregon coyote thistle, and we were very excited to get these guys because they were tough to get to germinate. These are some of the rare plants that we have on site. I talked about some of them already, so I'm not going to go into it, but it's a weird site. We have, this is the only one of this type of fern that I've found on site, and we've only found a couple examples of this orchid. So it's got a lot of rare plants in it. And one year I was lost trying to find this trail back to an open area in the woods, and happened upon this interesting flower. And I might have known it. I'm really a bird guy by training. I might have known it was a penstemon, but anyhow, I sent it up to our ecologist up in Olympia, and he's a botanist. Oops. And he keyed it out to Penstemon rydbergii variety or Oreocarius. And it's a plant that is really more in east of the Cascades. But it was a funny, if I hadn't been lost, I may not have found it. And if he hadn't gone to a conference and talked to someone from the Portland area and talked about this penstemon, we may never have known what it really is. So he talked to Elaine Stewart, and he told her about this penstemon that we found. And she said, well, that's interesting because we found a penstemon 4 or 5 years ago in the Portland area. And we think it's this species that was last seen in 1934 and thought to be extinct. And so, the penstemon experts confirm that it's a plant called tall beard's tongue or Penstemon hesperius. And it's only known for 3 or 4 sites in the Portland metro area, and then only in Lacamas Prairie in Washington. So we held a botany blitz where you kind of got amateur and professional botanists together, including, a couple of penstemon experts. And we basically, I wanted to know, was there more than just this one plant, and were there other rare plants, and were there other weeds that we need to watch out for? And so we kind of broke apart and scoured different chunks of the site. And, I was out with these, one of the penstemon guys, John Christie, and, we were walking through oak woodland, and he was kind of saying, this really isn't quite the right habitat. It's really kind of dry and it's not wet enough, basically, and not open enough. And so I kind of said, well, I know an area near the creek that might be pretty good. So we're kind of crashing through the brush and, looking for this open area under the oaks with dappled sunlight near the creek that's wetter. And we come out and there are hundreds of this gorgeous blue plant. And so it was probably one of the best days in the field that I've had for maybe ever. And there were several swear words that came out of my mouth when we happened upon this patch. But so we found this really cool patch of this penstemon with several hundred individuals. And it turns out it's this, now we're protecting the largest patch of this species anywhere. So really pretty plant. So that's it. I'm happy to take any questions anyone has. This is a shot of Washougal Oaks.
There are a couple questions.
Okay, sure.
One is, where does your funding come from? You mentioned that you were well funded for this.
Well, so our program is funded through DNR. So the legislature every 2 years appropriates funding for DNR and for every state agency. And so it really depends on how well the economy of the state's doing. So some years we're funded well and I mean, no, we're never really funded that well. I manage over 13,000 acres, and we've got 5 natural area managers statewide. So we're a very small program. But our program was almost shut down with the 2008-9 crash in the economy. Yeah. But our grants come from that RCO agency that is also legislatively appropriated. So, if the economy is doing well, then that pot is funded well. But if it's not, it gets cut back. So that's where our funding comes from. We will sometimes apply for federal grants, but not too often.
Thank you. And you mentioned bullfrogs. There's a question about, do you call for bullfrogs?
Do we call C-A-L-L or call?
C-U-L-L. Do you try to eradicate them?
No, we pick our battles, just like weeds. Some things you're never going to get rid of. And bullfrogs are one of them. They move, floods will bring in new tadpoles. If we had a rare frog there that we're trying to protect, then we might, so it really depends, but largely, yeah, bullfrogs, no, we don't. In fact, we don't try and control any animal species, but definitely invasive plants.
So there's another question, actually, they're starting to come in. Would the city of Camas ever be able to take over the Lacamas Prairie as eminent domain?
No, they're not really, they're not involved in this. I mean, it's just sort of a side partner, but they don't own any land within the boundary. And no, they might use eminent domain for roads, but no, not as part of our preserve system. We wouldn't last very long if we used eminent domain to protect land. It just doesn't work well. People don't tend to like that.
Yeah. There's a question about, would goats be useful in keeping on the blackberries and shiny geranium?
Blackberry, yes, and they are used in different parts of the country. The problem with them is you have to fence them in, so there's a lot of work that goes into it. And the other problem, which is a big one, is they eat everything. So they just, if you could keep them just in an area that has blackberry, then that might work. But yeah, we've looked into goats and sheep as controls, and people do use them, but they're pretty time intensive. So yeah, I mean, there are other options, and we've done digging, but the problem with digging is you really have to get all the root, and it's very time intensive, and you disturb the soil, which brings in different weeds. So.
And it looks like one more question is the Camas lily protected? No,
it's not, unfortunately. It gets protection within the a wet prairie ecosystem and protected at Lacamas, but no, I mean, that's the sad thing, is that you guys live in Clark County and you know how few places you can see Camas lilies. So what that means is that there's very little native prairie left. Where you see the Camas is where there's at least some remnant of native prairie. So that's why I really stress how important it is. Programs like ours and the Nature Conservancy and groups that are protecting examples of these rare plant communities or native plant communities are super important. So no, they don't get any protection. Even the great Camas isn't rare enough per se. It has to be really rare to get some form of protection. And even plants don't get the same protection that animals do. So there's really no teeth behind endangered species status for plants.
Okay, and perhaps we'll make this one the last question. Are there any types of plants in the Lacamas Prairie area that will help water quality that flows into Lacamas Round Lake? And that's in regard to the blue-green algae that has contaminated the lakes.
Wetland definitely is a filter. So by protecting wetland and keeping it from being filled in and houses built on it or having it drained, that is probably our best bet to filter some of this water. But no, the plants per se don't necessarily take up, well, I mean, they might take up some of the nutrients that come down and use them. But, unfortunately, prairies they're nitrogen poor systems, so they don't really like a lot of nitrogen. So high nitrogen systems aren't great because they tend to favor weeds. So yeah, I mean, I think yeah, the just having a wetland there is helps to filter and settle out some of those nutrients from getting into the lake. Yeah. Any other questions, or do you want to show that video?
There aren't other questions. I can go ahead and play the video. I'll go ahead and
sure.
take over the
And then
screen
I
from
can
you.
stick around afterwards. I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay.
So this is just a video. One of our firefighters, he had a business using drones he would do some recording for realtors, some aerial photography of different properties. And so he had a side business, but he brought his drone to one of our prescribed burns. And you can see that we mow the boundary lines. So there's a good mow line where you cut all the fuel. The wind's got to be just right. It's got to be the right direction, right temperatures. So this is a piece that we did right along Ingalls Road, and I had to get some flaggers. Well, yeah, I tried to get some flaggers because it was right along Ingalls Road, and if wind came across the road, it could disrupt traffic. And so I had hired these flaggers from a temp agency, and unfortunately they didn't show up. So fortunately the wind was blowing in the right direction, and we could do the burn. But yeah, you start a burn against the wind, so it just slowly creeps into the wind, and you create a black line, and then you go around the edges and you just black line all the way around it, and then you tie it off on the other end and the fire burns into itself. So yeah, these are super important ecological burns that are done, especially prairies and oak ecosystems, but even more frequently in forested areas where fire was super important in clearing out some of the understory and opening things up and thinning out some of the woodlands. So I think it was maybe 5 acres. We burn in pretty small chunks, 3 to 5 acres, because of invertebrates, butterflies and other invertebrates, you don't want to burn a whole prairie in one go because they will overwinter on some of the vegetation. So you want to just do small chunks here and there. So yeah, that's kind of our prescribed burn. We have to follow up and make sure it's fully out and coordinate with neighboring landowners and local fire departments.
What matters more to you than money?
That's funny. Yeah.
So anyhow, I'm happy to take any other questions or take them offline or whatever.
I think we put your, you have your email address that was on the slide there hanging for a long time. So I think that's it. Erica, do you have anything else, or John?
I don't have anything. There is one question, and I was curious too. How long did that burn take?
Oh, the actual burning of it? I guess okay. Boy, I would say, maybe 45 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes. It actually, it's hard to know because I'm so wrapped up in the whole thing, so I don't pay attention to time, but it goes pretty darn quick once you get it going. I would say 30 to 45 minutes, but there's a lot of prep work that goes into it, putting it together and laying out. So the whole thing is circled by hoses. So laying out the hose, getting the water sources in, so there's a lot of prep work that goes into it.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you much, Carlo. Everyone enjoyed it, and we had more people attend than I think even signed up. So that's great. We had a definitely 100% show up.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
Good.
And John gives a clap. Everyone, thank you all very much. And look in your email for next month's announcement as well as your election material.
All right.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks, Carlo.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you guys.